you might have been wrong about these cards. I know I certainly was. Boy, there are going to be some cards in this video I got very wrong, but so did a lot of you, because these are the most underrated cards from March of the Lich King. In other words, cards that were rated really poorly by the community in the pre-release ratings on that classic 5-star scale. These are cards that landed really in the bottom half of all cards in the set based on their scores, but in reality have outperformed the set. They've been some of the best cards in the entire game, in fact. So vastly overperforming based on expectations. And the perfect example of that here is Shock Spitter, which was the 80th highest rated card. So that is in the bottom half of all cards. But as we well know, Shock Spitter has already been nerfed, and it's still a tier 1 deck defining card. I think it's actually going to get nerfed again. So people thought, you know, this card's nothing special. I'm not even going to rate it high enough to be in the top half of all cards. Really one of the absolute best cards of the entire expansion. Absolutely crazy lethality on this one. I think this was probably held back because people thought the condition of this requiring attacks was going to hold it back too much, and it would just be hard for hunters to get enough attacks through. In reality, it just offers so much lethality, and it's so consistently tutored out of your deck with things like Selective Breeder and copied with things like Selective Breeder, that there's so much lethal punch here that it's worth it for the hunter to dedicate enough of their deck to really supporting this. So I'm assuming people thought the condition was going to hold it back. In reality, that condition has really not been a challenge at all, but the crazy burst just made up for it anyway. So as we all know, Shock Spitter Hunter is peaked here in the top 10 of cards played in this expansion, and from a power level standpoint, right up there at the very top, probably number 1, honestly, since I think it's going to eat 2 different nerfs. Now, this is one I got closer to being right. I got 4 stars here as my rating, but really this is a 5-star card. No question, has been incredibly meta defining. So even I underrated this one a little bit at 4 stars. The community putting it in the bottom half definitely underrated this one as well. Should be number 1 or number 2, not number 80. But this is actually the least underrated card in this video. It's in the top of the expansion for underrated cards, but there's going to be even more in this video that are more underrated than this, believe it or not. Like this one, Infectious Ghoul. This fellow was rated 89th. But actually peaked at a top 5 spot here for its play rate. That is because, if you remember, Death Rattle Rogue, prior to getting nerfed, was absolutely everywhere on ladder and was doing some bonkers things with this card in combination with the Kobold Scourge Illusionist. Not the Kobold Illusionist, that's the old one. Cheating out, 4 or 5 of these early in the game. Your opponent just had these boards that were literally unstoppable if you didn't have silence. Endless waves of infectious ghouls, and of course that would just absolutely run away with Hearthstone games and felt really busted and got a quick, swift nerf, as it probably deserved. Not Infectious Ghoul itself, but the deck, of course. And I didn't see that either. I didn't see that potential. I gave this card 2 stars. I thought, this was that kind of bad Greybow, and Greybow didn't really get played a lot in standard format. We've certainly had some fun with Greybow elsewhere. But I thought, without this having taunt, it just won't be able to interact well. Like, you'll just plop this down and the opponent will kind of just ignore it and run past it and hit you in the face, or just deal with one of these at a time. It's no big deal. It's hard to force the action when you don't have taunt in this Greybow effect, was my belief. In reality, the rogue is just cheating this out so quickly and activating the Death Rattle so immediately that it becomes a really big board all at once, and it forces your hand to deal with it. Otherwise, you're just going to get ran over by the Infectious Ghouls. Instead of a kind of slow plodding threat that came down on turn 5 or 6, like many of us might have expected, it became this immense threat very early in the game that had to be dealt with, or you would just die to all the damage, because these 5/4s made it a pretty nice high pressure threat if a few of them were able to get going on board, on top of everything else that deck was doing and cheating into play. So really caught me off guard here for sure. certainly exceeded expectations among the community as well. This was really one of the defining cards of the early March of the Lich King meta. This thing was completely bonkers. So next up here, we have the Felderai Warband, which was rated at 95th, just barely inside the top 100, which is crazy. And in reality, got up to number 4, peaking at 19% of decks. We've seen Spell Demon Hunter varieties using this card to great success, particularly in combination with the card Sinful Brand, where this can be, 4 damage to face if you want. That's great. And then these 1/1s with Rush actually can toss in a lot of extra damage and lethality on the back of Sinful Brand, marking a target, and then those trading in doing, 2 or sometimes even 4 damage if you have a couple Sinful Brands. So it becomes this really powerful threat in your deck, but in a pinch too can be exactly what it kind of reads at face value, which is a little swing card, clear a threat on board, develop some of your own, take some extra trades. It just has a shocking amount of utility combined with that eventual lethality as well. Now, I gave this card 3 stars, thought it was going to be okay. I didn't think Spell Demon Hunter made a lot of sense, even with Scythe. I just didn't really think that deck would quite get there. I thought Scythe would be its own good card, but maybe not the supporting cards so much. Clearly, that was wrong. This has been a very good deck, especially in really high ranks. This deck's absolutely insane. I wonder if people looked at the artwork on this one and were like, this just looks too goofy. I can't give this a good score. I still think the poses on these guys are like so robotic. They look like kind of action figure marionette type poses or something. And the dude's just so big and pink and goofy. But yeah, Felderai Warband, obviously a very, very powerful card. And this may not be the last Demon Hunter card we're going to see on this list. But first, let's talk about a mage card. Arcane Defenders actually making the list here. This one was rated at 2.9 stars or 121st place. That is bottom of the barrel. Anything under 3 stars for community ratings is basically garbage, because everybody wants to like cards. So somebody out there is giving every card 5 stars. And that, that pulls the ratings up naturally. So as you can see, 121st place is really, really bad. In reality, Arcane Defenders is actually a top 25 card in the expansion because of its inclusion in Big Spell Mage, which is a high tier 2 deck right now at most ranks. Turns out getting these 2, 5, 6 taunts that are kind of awkward to deal with can be really nice. And then resummoning those with Dawn Grasp or Grey Sage Parrot can help you build some really nice, reliable boards that are hard for a lot of different decks to deal with. So these prove to be a very effective tool for Big Spell Mage. I was a little more hopeful at 3 stars. I know 3 stars versus 2.9 stars may not sound like a notable difference, but just given the distribution of ratings, 3 stars for me is way better than 3 stars for the community. Still underrated though. This card's been a 4-star card easy, man. It's been really solid. So even though I was a little closer, still underrated Arcane Defenders. This is kind of the perfect big spell for Big Spell Mage, and indeed made the cut. So next up here is the Plague Spreader. This is a card you probably don't think about too much, but Plague Spreader Priest has been a deck that's running around at various points, peaking at 7.9% of decks running the Plague Spreader, because this can be pretty interesting little tech card that disrupts your opponent's stuff. And in Priest in particular, where you have other Death Rattle synergies to resummon this guy or reactivate its Death Rattle, you can completely wipe out your opponent's hands. We saw some pretty crazy games with this one in various tournament settings, just being this ultimate disruption tool. And that means it's underrated because it was rated 113th, well outside the top 100. Instead, actually peaked at 16th. I gave this one 3 stars, which again is a little underrated. This has been a 4-star card so far in the March of the Lich King meta. I'm sure people just thought like, oh, what are you really going to do with this one? What's the purpose of it? Is it really going to make the cut in a deck? In reality, the disruption value is just high enough that it did, especially when duplicated. Maybe people forgot this one was going to get duplicated and multiple of these Death Rattles were going to go off. Maybe they thought the downside of getting your own stuff return Plague Spreadered would be too much of a negative, but some decks don't care about that. They just care more about screwing with their opponent's stuff, and in fact having more play spreaders might be beneficial as opposed to a downside for something like Priest, where they just want to be able to mess with you even more at the cost of their own resources. So I'm actually kind of glad Plague Spreader got some play. This is a fun card in a way. I know it's kind of troll and kind of disruptive and crazy, but I like that. I like when a more unreliable, more goofy game plan works better than a hyper refined game plan. So if we can break up people's super consistent combos and stuff, sign me up for that. I'm glad Plague Spreader was underrated. Now this one, I can't believe this one. Keen Eye Spotter is an underrated card. It was rated 3 stars by the community, 117th place. In reality, has peaked at 9.4% inclusion rate. That's good for 11th place, and this card is getting played actually a lot right now. Shockspitter Hunter is using the Keen Eye Spotter as a way to deal with early threatening board stuff. Particularly in combination with Candlestick, that can be a really good way to clear something quite nicely without taking damage. So crazy big rogue minions cheated into play or whatever it might be. Now I give this card 2 stars. I thought personally this just seemed like way too much overhead for this kind of effect. Like, who's gonna want to spend 3 mana just to take a swing on board? You know, it's still got some, you know, risk if you're not immune in particular, right? Like, oh, I'm gonna take all this damage to clear something. Like, aren't there better removal cards? Aren't there better options? I think I personally underestimated the size of things that would need to be removed, because Rogue and all these people just make gigantic things. I thought, you know, if you're clearing a 3/4 or something, this Keen Eye Spotter is just not going to be worth it. But if you're clearing 10/10s and stuff, maybe you have to use the Keen Eye Spotter, because there aren't like spell alternatives that deal with it quite as effectively. So that's probably underestimation number 1. But also, I might have underestimated, like all of us, really everybody underrated this one, that the deck would play a little bit more like a combo deck almost for Shockspitter Hunter, where they can spend a lot of early mana just keeping things in check, because they're really playing more towards a combo finisher as opposed to a chip damage over time sort of deck, which I think I expected a little bit more for this kind of attack build. So using your turns and mana early just to stay in the game while accruing those lethal burst hits at the end is a little bit different of a play pattern than I expected. So spending time and mana on Keen Eye Spotter actually makes sense in that world, because you need to stay alive into your Shockspitter turns later. So sure enough, Keen Eye Spotter, pretty darn underrated here, 106 spots difference. And I missed this one. I think I went down pretty hard on this card at 2 stars, and it's actually been really good. So next up here, we have our second most underrated card, the Mark of Scorn, rated at 3.1 by the community, good for 113th place. I guess that was even lower than the Felderai Warband here. These kind of go together with the no minion package, but people liked the Warband better. I think myself included, right? Yeah, I also liked the Warband a little better. Of course, it has also been played a ton, actually not as much as the Warband, but also rated notably higher, so a larger difference there in the placements from 113th to 7th. I only gave this one 2 stars. I remember saying fairly specifically, like, is this even that good if you hit the condition? And I kind of maintain that. Like, I still don't think this card's crazy out of line, you know, assuming it works every time, which it very often does. When you build your deck correctly, this works every time. And it's good, of course. Like, deal 3, draw a card, that's really good, but it's not like crazy compared to what Demon Hunter already does. Cards like Chaos Strike, you know, is effectively deal 2 and draw a card, and this didn't have a fell tag, so I thought, well, maybe it's not going to really support Jace all that well. But of course, the reality is there's a critical mass achieved with all of these cards where you just want to stack up enough damage and enough ways to kill people, and this contributes rather nicely to the game plan. So even if it doesn't like individually stand out from a power level standpoint, which it is obviously very good, I think I underestimated it at a general level, but also in that kind of greater context as well, it just fits in. It's just a nice puzzle piece. And that means it gets played. That means it's represented in the data, of course, because it's a solid enough card to make the cut. In particular, this is another one that benefits from spell damage, much like the card Unleash Fel. Now, that was not underrated because everybody thought it was going to be nuts. But, you know, these cards benefit from spell damage even when they're not targeting anything, which is a great teaser, I guess, for our number one card. So let's go ahead and talk about that in combination here, because number one is the Silver Moon Arcanist. This was the most underrated card of the entire expansion. Spell damage +2. Your spells can't target heroes this turn, which is great for the Mark of Scorn, because as long as your opponent is the lowest health enemy, which is not particularly difficult to achieve, when you're wiping a board with Unleash Fel, all your opponent has left is their face, and then this is getting bonus spell damage. Suddenly deal 5 and draw a card, especially if this is like 0 mana because you've discounted it via Demon Hunter shenanigans, or 1 mana, I guess is more likely. That can be absolutely nuts. 1 mana, deal 5, thanks to the Silver Moon Arcanist, is absolutely bonkers. And of course, Silver Moon Arcanist also getting driven here by Demon Hunter. Spell Demon Hunter, no minion Demon Hunter is absolutely bonkers on the back of Silver Moon Arcanist. This was rated 2.2 stars, 141st place. That is the bottom 4 cards of this expansion. This expansion was a little bigger than normal at 145. This is 141st. So I guess bottom 5 cards. I gave this 1 star. I said, who's going to want spell damage that can't go face? There's other spell damage cards. They only cost 1 more mana. Who cares about this? Just run a 4 mana spell damage card. But the way this Demon Hunter deck was constructed, the 1 mana mattered a lot more than the can't target face aspect did, because all of these spells, like Mark of Scorn, they don't need to target face anyway. Unleash Fel doesn't need to target face anyway. So you just got a free mana basically over some of the other 4 mana options. So you know, I didn't see that coming. I didn't realize that the mana would be worth so much more than the targeting. It sure felt like it was swapped. I thought the targeting would be worth way more, but the Demon Hunter spells just supported that so nicely, and in fact has made spell no minion Demon Hunter one of the best decks in this meta, particularly at high ranks. Demon Hunter is absolutely busted alongside Rogue, still at higher ranks, and before the Unleash Fel nerf in particular, this deck was absolutely dominant at high ranks, really in large part thanks to the Silver Moon Arcanist. So we were all baited into thinking this card can't go face, it must be terrible, right? That's the normal logic. 1 star, 2.2 stars to the community, which is basically as bad as it gets, right? It just can't be good. It can't go face, but we didn't realize secretly it can go face, and that has made it an insanely good card. This has been one of the best cards of the set, peaked at 6th for inclusion rate, and man, I think probably the most underrated card ever in one of these videos, particularly because we have more cards this set. So a difference here of 135 spots is basically a normal full expansion from first to last. So this is probably the highest we're ever gonna get as far as a card being underrated. We absolutely missed the mark on no minion Demon Hunter and the Silver Moon Arcanist in particular. And there you go, folks. Those are the most underrated cards. I'm curious, which ones did you get right? Did you know Shockspitter was going to be absolutely busted? Did you see the writing on the wall for no minion Demon Hunter? I know none of you, all of you got these right. None of you got these wrong. You're all geniuses. This data comes from other people in the community who got it wrong. It can't be us. None of you could have predicted these incorrectly. So excited to hear all the I told you so's in the comments. What other cards did you surprise you this set? What other cards did you personally underrate? I'm curious to hear some of those. But that said, thanks so much as always for watching, and until next time, game on.